Hello and welcome back. Today we are continuing our lecture series on industrialization and the progressive movement. And today we're going to discuss kind of one of the more interesting progressives and progressive presidents, and that's Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, this guy right here, very interesting. He was born into a very wealthy family, made its money initially in the stained glass window business, importing stained glass windows. They're kind of like this legacy family in the United States, as close to an American aristocracy as you can get. It's believed that his mom actually who is from the South. She's the Roosevelt family's from the North in New York. But his mom was, a Southern kind of aristocrat, for lack of a better term, who people believe that the figure of Scarlett O'Hara is based on in the movie Gone with the Wind. So, this is kind of like a legendary American family. Teddy Roosevelt, the very, very rich, gets the best education that you can buy. He's got private tutors his whole life. He's actually born sickly. He's got what we believe today is like very serious respiratory problem like asthma and when he's young, and that's really going to affect his life because he spends most of his time inside reading. He learns Latin, and collects insects and labels them in their original Latin. Voracious reader. We actually believe he has an eidetic memory, which means that he essentially remembers everything that he reads. So he's this really great student. But he's always kind of jealous because his father's very active. He's constantly looking outside, seeing other kids being active, and eventually one day the story goes, his dad comes in and says, "Look, you have this sickly, kind of condition, and that if you ever want to get better, you're just going to have to force your body to become strong." And his dad puts him on an exercise regimen, constantly takes him for hikes out in nature, and it really makes Teddy Roosevelt believe in what he refers to as the strenuous life. And that it's this idea that you should always be in motion, you should always be challenging yourself physically and mentally. And he lives this really kind of Renaissance life where, he's going to become a boxer at college, although by reports he's not the greatest boxer. Although when he becomes president, he's going to be boxing people in the White House. He's going to be an avid, hiker. He's going to attempt to be a cowboy for a while in his youth. He's unsuccessfully, but he's going to teach him very important lessons. He's a voracious reader, just reads all the time. He writes multiple books. Just kind of really turns his life around, and he's like kind of the quintessential kind of you can do anything you can set your mind to belief in Americana. And so that's who Teddy is. He's this just totally active guy, becomes famous as a rough rider during the Spanish American War in the battle for San Juan in Cuba. His Rough Rider is a really formative experience for him. It really stems out of his time in the Badlands as a cowboy, as a rancher. What happens is, he goes to Harvard. He's a Harvard guy, Harvard Society, and starts a career in law, and is just essentially kind of going on that track. Dabbles in politics like his dad did. His dad was a very famous New York politician, local politician, and he's dabbling in that life. And his wife, who he loves tremendously, who is pregnant, and they're about to have their daughter. Goes into labor on Valentine's Day, and he's working, and he gets a call, and essentially is told to come home. There's complications, and he finds out on the same day that his mother has fallen ill, and as he's racing to get back home to be with his his wife who's having complications and his mother who's having health issues. They both die on Valentine's Day, and it just destroys Teddy. I mean, he's got money, so he doesn't have to stick around for his career, and it's destroyed him so bad that he just essentially takes off. His newborn daughter, who he never really has a good relationship with, he leaves to the care of family, to his sister essentially, and to hired help, and heads out to the Badlands to start a cattle ranch. When he gets out there, he's hoping to be able to, hunt bison and all these things, and really, kind of gives up his Eastern elite lifestyle to be a cowboy out west. And he's always, because he read so much, has read stories about how the West, you can challenge yourself and really become a man out west. And he's always felt like a sickly inner child that he should challenge himself that way. And he goes out, and it's a real formative experience because he realizes really quickly that his Eastern education isn't going to help him much on a cattle ranch. And he learns that the majority of cowboys at the time aren't your John Wayne white guy cowboys. That's a Hollywood myth. Most of your cowboys at the time are Hispanic or African American. It's one of the, if you're a minority in America at the time, the cowboy lifestyle is one of the better paying jobs that you can get. And also, the idea for cattle ranching comes from, Mexico. And so, they taught us how to cowboy. And so when he goes out there, he's exposed to this really diverse crowd of talented people. His cattle ranch will ultimately fail, but he makes all these connections, and he realizes, very quickly that you should judge people by their ability and not necessarily by their skin color. And, when he later he comes back to the, eventually he'll come back to the Northeast. And when he does, he comes back with a different idea about how to judge people. And so, eventually he'll become the Undersecretary of the Navy. And when war breaks out, he'll give up that post to form the Rough Riders. And when he forms the Rough Riders, it's this really diverse group of people. It's going to have Native Americans. It's going to have some Harvard and Yale guys, and it's also going to have kind of your blue collar workers. And so for the time period, it's extremely diverse group of people because he just puts them together based on ability and not necessarily skin color. And he's going to take that lesson for the rest of his life. I mean, he's going to be the first president to invite an African American to the White House for a formal sit-down dinner, which he'll catch a lot of flack from the South. But he kind of is the one of the first presidents that's really on a personal level starts to kind of recognize the importance of judging people by their ability and their choices and not their skin color. And so he becomes famous because of his Rough Riders, and that will ultimately propel him into a very successful political career. So, strong believer in the strenuous life. When he eventually becomes the police commissioner of New York City, he's on his way to the White House. He's at first the police commissioner of New York City. He's going to spend time traveling around New York City with Jacob Riis, who's a progressive journalist who is taking photographs of the urban poor and really kind of exposing, how bad the urban poor have it. This is another formative experience for Teddy Roosevelt because, he's from, the absolute top economic class in America, and so he's extremely wealthy, and isn't really exposed to poverty, and so he gets to kind of see how the other half lives. That's a reference to Jacob Riis's book. He sees that and is going to be very sympathetic to it and recognize, like, oh, hey, this capitalist system that we live in is great because it's created all kinds of wealth and innovation, and all that is really good, and he believes that. But it's also leaving certain people out, and so he recognizes that although the system is a good system, that doesn't mean it's perfect, and it should be changed, and that's really going to I mean, that's what his presidency is going to be about. It's not going to be about destroying big business. It's not belief that big business is the enemy. It's the belief that big businesses that don't act properly are the enemy, and he's going to go after them. He also targets the political criminal class and political machines as police commissioners. He goes after the political machines, and he says, "Look, you're stealing from the people. You're demanding bribes. You're doing all these kind of these illegal activities," and he goes after him, which eventually is going to actually make him a pariah in politics. He is a Republican. And so, the fact that he goes after the political machines that are being controlled and paid for by a lot of these big businesses is going to make him, persona non grata in the Republican Party, which means the Republican Party, even though he's a Republican, they don't like him because he's trying to reform the political machines that are benefiting that party. And so, what they do is to essentially make him less powerful is they promote him. They promote him to the vice president under William McKinley. And the reason is because up until this point, it's the vice presidency isn't like it is today. Today, it's like the stepping stone to becoming president. It's an important position. But for most of American history, the Constitution really gives very little power to the vice president, essentially just to break the tie in Senate votes, which very rarely happens. And so there's no real power there unless the president gives them power. And so the idea is make him vice president. He'll essentially have no more power to take on the political machines, and we can keep the status quo. So, he gets appointed to being vice president, and then in just a twist of fate, for the Republican Party, he is going to become president because William McKinley is going to be assassinated by an anarchist. And so William McKinley, who's a Republican, is deemed to be a pro-business president, and he's going to be shot by an anarchist that was really kind of upset about the fact that when he was a kid, he worked in factories as child labor, and so he shoots William McKinley and kills William McKinley. Teddy Roosevelt's going to essentially take over after that, and when he does, he's got a couple of big goals. One of them is to make America a world power. He believes that the future of America is going to be in America's Navy, so he's going to help develop the what they call the Great White Fleet. It's the American Navy. They call it White Fleet. That's not a racial thing. It's because when a metal ship is on the horizon and the sun hits it, it sets out this really bright white light, and so that's the name. That's why it gets that name. And which is a good thing because we're quickly approaching World War I here, where we're going to need a strong Navy. So he's going to update the Navy. That should be a no-brainer from the guy that used to be essentially the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So he's going to want to do that, and he's going to want to start to regulate monopolies in big business. And so he doesn't want to crush big business. He recognizes big business makes products that increase the standard of living for everybody, which ultimately mostly helps the poor, and it employs people. So those are two good things, but they're only good if they don't exploit their work. Well, I shouldn't say they're only good if they don't exploit their workers, but if you exploit your workers, it might negate the good that you do. And so he wants to continue to allow big business to do the things that benefit everybody and eliminate the unsafe work conditions, the price manipulations, and those things. So he's going to be a monopoly buster, or what is referred to as a trust buster, which is another form of monopoly. But he's not going after all businesses, just the ones that he deems are bad for society. And so that's kind of what his agenda is going to be when he gets into office. So here's a artist's rendition of the assassination of William McKinley, which will ultimately put Teddy Roosevelt in power. So Roosevelt was a progressive. And essentially, even though he was a progressive, he wants to go after the industrialists, but he also did support business as long as business didn't act against the public good. And so he's hard to define. The average Republican at the time tended to err more on the side of big business, and the average Democrat was aired more on the side of anti-big business, and Roosevelt kind of took the more complicated middle, right? Recognizing that business isn't always good, it isn't always bad. That we need to take a more moderate approach to these things and judge each of these businesses kind of based on their own individual standards. So he is going to essentially his platform is going to be referred to as the square deal, right? He's going to talk about every American deserves a square deal with their government, a good and fair deal, right? All citizens should have equal opportunity to succeed through strong personal ethics, a sense of fairness, and an adherence to the spirit of law. So he's talking about everybody should have an equal opportunity, right? Contrary to socialism, which says, it's not about the opportunity, it's about everybody should have an equal outcome. Roosevelt recognizes, well, that's not going to happen. Some people are going to work harder than others. Some people are just naturally more intelligent than others. But we need to make sure that everybody gets treated fairly. So everybody has a fair shot to achieve as much as they're capable of or as much as they're willing to work for. And so, he's going to use that platform to make sure that businesses don't stand in the way of people's ability to, achieve, and make sure that the law doesn't stand in the way of getting in the way of people achieving what they're capable of achieving. Now, the square deal is going to have three elements to it. One is going to be the conservation of natural resources. Again, he's a hunter, right? He's a big game hunter. And so we're talking. He wants to, like, lions, tigers, all that stuff before it was, kind of socially unacceptable, and when a lot of those animals weren't as endangered as they are today. I'm not making excuses for him here. But what we do know about the vast majority of hunters is they're conservationists. And they're conservationists because, they recognize the thing that they love. There has to be balance in the environment if they're going to do it, right? You can't just go out and kill all of one thing. And that's how he comes to love the conservation of nature. It's when he was a kid and his dad would take him on hikes and would take him out swimming and doing all of these things. He loved being outdoors, but also he recognized when he went out to the Badlands, he wanted to be able to hunt bison. But by the late 1800s, we had killed all but about 200 bison. And so when he gets out there, he's like, I want to hunt bison, and they're gone. And he recognizes, like, this is horrible. If we don't do something, and if it's the federal government doesn't do something to make sure we preserve these resources, future generations won't be able to benefit from it. So he wants to conserve natural resources, which means he's really going to set up what is today the national park system. The Antiquities Act is going to set aside all kinds of land that is essentially going to say you can't develop these. You can't develop this area. We got to let nature take over so other future generations can enjoy it. Two, control over corporations. Any kind of monopoly that is acting outside the best interests of the public good or the law, he's going to essentially break up. And then consumer protections. He's going to be responsible for the Elkins and Hepburn Act, which is going to make sure that railroads don't gouge prices for the smaller businesses and farmers. The Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act are going to come from him, which essentially means you can't have dirty conditions in the butcher shops, and they're making people sick. You can't mislabel food. You can't take rotten beef that beef should be red. You can't take the rotten beef that's turned like gray and sell it as goat meat, because again, that'll make people sick. And so he's going to want to protect consumers from unscrupulous businesses. So one of the first businesses that he's actually going to go after is going to be J.P. Morgan's Northern Securities Company. And so J.P. Morgan is the richest, most powerful man in America. And by most powerful, I mean up until Teddy Roosevelt, he is more powerful than presidents. He has personally bailed the American government out of recessions. There was a bond market crisis, and the economy was destabilizing, and he essentially single-handedly went in and bought enough stocks and bonds to stabilize the market. I mean, that's how powerful he is, how much money he has, right? Yeah, he's going to buy Edison Electric and make it GE Electric. He's going to he's going to buy Carnegie Steel and make it U.S. Steel. These are the biggest businesses in history, and he's going to own them. So, I mean, that's how much money he has. It's unheard of wealth. And Roosevelt's going to take him on. And so essentially, what he's going to do is he's going to use the Sherman Antitrust Act, which has been around for a while now. The Sherman Antitrust Act essentially said, that any kind of monopoly can be regulated by the federal government. Well, it had been used up until this point, but it had almost always been used against unions, saying that unions were monopolizing labor and breaking up unions. Well, Teddy Roosevelt isn't going to use the law that way. He's going to go after Northern Securities. And when he does, JP Morgan gets kind of frustrated, and he essentially has his people call up the president and says, hey, we need to meet. We could just work this out. You don't need to take this to court and try and break up my company. If we've got a problem, talk to me, and I can smooth things over. And Teddy Roosevelt essentially calls him in and takes him to task and says, you don't dictate terms to me. I dictate terms to you. And I'm going to break this up legally because I'm going to show you who's boss, essentially. And so essentially the claim is that the Northern Securities owns several significant portions of railroads, and that they were using regional monopolies, not nationwide monopolies, but regional monopolies to gouge prices for people that are shipping goods on the railroad. And so he's going to win this case. Northern Securities will essentially be broken up, and JP Morgan's going to be forced to sell parts of this, to sell parts of his business, which, at the time they're going to get criticized for. Roosevelt will be criticized for, this being an uncapitalistic move, which in reality it's not. Capitalism is all about competition and different people competing to make the best product to be able to sell, and monopolies are not a part of that, right? I mean, if you have a monopoly, there's no competition, which means there's nothing driving people to innovate or to drive down prices. Monopolies, are essentially communistic, right? I mean, communism is essentially when the government has a monopoly over all business. And so, Roosevelt kind of sees it that way. If he doesn't articulate it that way, he sees it that way. And so he thinks that busting up these monopolies is good for capitalism and good for democracy. And I think he's probably right there. So Teddy will he'll become known for becoming a trust buster, and they're going to start to call him a trust buster because he's going to go after Northern Securities. He's going to go around and break up about 25 more of these trusts or monopolies, and he's going after them. And it's not he doesn't even really think of himself as a trust buster, because that's misrepresentative of what he's doing. He's not busting up monopolies just because they're monopolies. In some cases, he believes monopolies can be good, right? If you use your monopoly to, be able to make things cheaper, to streamline the process, to make things cheaper. If you're hiring people and paying them a decent wage because you have a monopoly, he's going to leave you alone. Right? He's only going after the people that as soon as they get the companies that as soon as they get a monopoly, they jack up the prices, they drop the wages, and really kind of go after the vulnerable. And so he goes through and gets a reputation for essentially fairly breaking up these monopolies. Right. Another example of his involvement in the economy, which is not laissez-faire capitalism, right? We're past that now. This is because he's breaking up, laissez-faire capitalism means hands-off capitalism, no government regulation. That is definitely not TR, right? He's saying, look, we're going to be a regulated form of capitalism. And one of those regulations is no more monopolies that are abusing their power. Another example of regulated capitalism is going to be his involvement in the coal strike of 1902. So in 1902, there's been this coal strike, anthracite coal strike, going on for 5 months, and the wages are low for these workers. There's all kinds of layoffs. The company towns look like this. They're essentially like wooden shacks with no running water. They've got pump wells. There's no adequate schools for the kids that live in these coal towns. And so a coal town is just a town that the company essentially builds next to the coal mine, because a lot of times coal mines, they're located out in the middle of nowhere. And so the working conditions are absolutely terrible. And working in a coal mine is dangerous. It's unsafe. The coal mines collapse sometimes, and these coal miners want safer working conditions. They want safety regulations in the mine, and there's just the breathing in of coal dust will shorten your lifespan tremendously. And so the coal workers are demanding a raise. They want shorter hours, and they go on strike to get it. Well, this is scary for America because at the time, it's this anthracite coal that's heating the majority of American homes, and winter's about to come. And if the North and the Northeast in particular doesn't get access to this coal, a lot of people are going to freeze to death in the winter. And so Teddy Roosevelt really wants this to get worked out. But the owners are not interested in negotiating at all. They believe that even if they negotiate at all, even if they sit down with these workers, they'll be essentially delegating away their power. They don't want to be told how to run their companies. And so the owners are very resistant to settling this. So Teddy Roosevelt decides to be a mediator. A mediator is just an independent third party that listens to both sides and then offers suggestions for compromise. And so he brings both sides to the White House, and essentially it's a little bit more complicated than this, but essentially sits both sides down to talk. And there's a whole farce because the coal mine owners don't want to say they're negotiating with the coal miners, and there's a panel put together to be, and they don't want union members to be on it, but too much detail. We don't want to get lost in the weeds. The idea is both sides come to the White House. Scientists are brought in, experts are brought in, economists are brought in by the White House as this progressive idea. Again, progressives really believe in science and the ability of science to solve our problems. They sit down, listen to both sides, and essentially offer up suggestions for how to move forward. Right? And the coal owners, the workers are willing to negotiate. They see this and they're like, holy cow, the president is not just squashing our side. And so they're willing to play ball with the president. They realize they're probably not going to get everything they want, but if they play their cards right, they'll get something. And so they're really excited about it. So when the workers show up, the union representatives show up, they're willing to listen. They're very nice to the White House. The coal owners, on the other hand, they're essentially divisive. They're not willing to cooperate and essentially reject everything. They're not willing to listen at all. Well, don't do that to Teddy, right? Teddy's this rough and tumble guy. He doesn't like being told no. He's a boxer and a hunter and not a guy you want to mess with. And he's willing to negotiate, and the coal owners aren't. And so what he essentially says, okay, then I'm going to draft the entire workforce and your mines into the military. I'm going to nationalize these coal mines, and I'm going to say, look, this is a national emergency. If we don't get coal out to these homes, this is going to be disastrous for us. So what I'll do is I'll draft you all into the military and force you to go to work, force you to open up the mines. I'll force you as a part of the military to pay these miners military wages or fair wages, and we'll do it that way. And then it ain't going to be your mine anymore. And the coal owners look around and they're like, can you do that? And Teddy Roosevelt's like, watch me. And the coal owners look at that and they're like, oh, we don't want to risk that. And so what they end up doing is they end up actually starting to negotiate. And so the coal owners will essentially sit down, and the miners will get a 10% pay increase. They'll get a reduction of hours. They want an 8-hour workday, but they end up getting a 9-hour workday. Because again, even after Teddy Roosevelt essentially threatens to nationalize the mine, he still wants to compromise. I mean, he recognizes that, these owners to be able to keep their business afloat and keep coal moving out to the public, that they've got to make a profit. And so, it's not, he doesn't, even though he's seen as being sympathetic to the working man, he's also seen as being fair. And I think that's the key here. So they'll get 9-hour, end up getting a 9-hour workday. And this will be very popular with the public and will lead to his getting elected outright in 1904. Because remember, he wasn't his original term, he wasn't elected. Part of his campaign is going to be, this idea that he saved America from, freezing to death because of the coal strike. And so you see, political cartoons like this, or Uncle Sam, we must have that coal. And you see Teddy Roosevelt as this larger than life figure that essentially was able to cow big business into doing what was best for the entire country. So that leads us to the election of 1904, where Teddy Roosevelt is going to be running against Eugene V. Debs. Eugene V. Debs is a socialist who, believes that the government should control property, that should set wages and have equal distribution of wealth, across the board, which Teddy absolutely opposes. Right? He recognizes that for what it is, and so which is prescient, right? I mean, he's at the time when you're talking about 1904, there aren't a lot of examples of failed socialism yet. Like today, we can look around the globe and see socialism and communism just outright fails essentially every time that it's tried. And it's because this idea of everybody getting paid the same destroys people's will to actually want to work. It doesn't matter how hard you work to get paid. Everybody gets paid equally. It doesn't allow for innovation, creating new products, because if you invent something new, you're not going to be able to receive a monetary reward for doing it. So if you're not rewarded, why bother? And, so Teddy really hates this. He loves the idea of equal opportunity, that people should strive to be the best that they can, that they should have the freedom to either choose to be a shoemaker or an engineer, and that those choices will have economic consequences, but you'll get to choose and you'll get to do what you love. And so he really hates this idea of socialists. As he's running, he gets a boost from the coal strike and his handling of that. He gets his boost because he's not this capitalist that says, pure capitalism is good and the rich deserve to have all the wealth. He's not that. He's a regulated capitalist kind of guy, and he's breaking up these industries that abuse workers and advocating for for regulation that's going to help worker, and he's going to promise in the election of 1904 that if he wins, he won't run for another term. A promise that he will later regret and will break essentially. So Teddy essentially wins easily. I mean, Eugene V. Debs is going to get a tremendous amount of votes. He'll get over 1 million votes, but Teddy is going to be wildly popular, and he'll take essentially every state outside of the South, and so very, very strong support for Teddy Roosevelt. Now, when he gets into office, he is going to expand the powers of the government. Then, and to be progressive, you have to do that. If you're going to increase regulation, well, the government's going to have to regulate. And so, which means a larger government. And so, one of the things that he does is he creates the Department of Commerce and Labor. Today, those are two separate departments within the government, and one commerce, that's for business, and their job is to promote business in America, and there's a department for labor, which is designed to promote the interest of workers. Now, this goes a lot to the psychology of Teddy Roosevelt. There's been a Department of Commerce for a while, and it's Samuel Gompers, who is the guy that is the head of the AFL, right? So the America's largest union at the time. He essentially tells Teddy, he's like, hey, business has a department within your cabinet and your advisors, and so there are people that advise you on the interest of business. Why isn't there anybody there advising you on the interest of workers? And Teddy Roosevelt, because he's a guy that wants to have all the information, he wants to compromise. He's not this ideologue where business is always right or workers are always right. He looks around and he's like, hey, you're right, and I need to fix that. And he thinks that business and labor aren't necessarily at odds with each other, that they can get along. And that's a real deep insight. The fact that he makes it the Department of Commerce and Labor, right? It's one department to advocate for the needs of both, really shows his belief that the two can get along, particularly if, the government helps become the mediator there. And so he creates the Department of Commerce and Labor. He's also going to pass the Elkins Act, which will make it illegal for corporations to give secret rebates to preferred customers. This really kind of targeting railroads these secret. You got to make these rebates public, because if you discount to one customer, you're probably increasing the rates on another. And so this is one of those things that farmers were really complaining about, is that big business, because they filled a ton of trains with goods, got all these rebates, and essentially, the railroads were shipping their goods at next to no profit, and then to make up for that profit, they were overcharging farmers. And so the Elkins Act is going to help regulate that. It's going to say you have to essentially disclose who you're giving rebates to. The other thing that he's going to pass is also connected to that, is the which gives the Interstate Commerce Commission. And so the Constitution says the federal government has the ability to regulate any trade between states. So if trade crosses state lines, federal government has the ability to regulate that. So the Interstate Commerce Commission is the part of the government that regulates that. And so almost all railroads cross state lines, which means the federal government has the constitutional right to regulate them. And so the Hepburn Act gives the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ability to set maximum rates for railroads. And so it essentially says, look, you can't overcharge customers to ship goods. It's too important that we are able to ship food across the country that you can't run these farmers out of business. The farmers are too important to the economy and to the health and well-being of people. Now, that maximum rate can be adjusted, right? And so if a railroad essentially says, look, I have to make a profit and I'm no longer making a profit, they can go to the ICC, and if they can prove it, the ICC can adjust those rates. But it requires government involvement to do that. Right, and it gives the ICC the ability to extend its power to not just railroads but pipelines, any freighting companies, sleeping car companies. So like the ability, like not just the transport of goods but also of people. So I mean, this is going to be vitally important to protect farmers, particularly out west. He's also a conservationist, like we had talked about before. He is going to set aside about 172 million acres to land. These are the giant redwoods out in California. This is a passion of Teddy Roosevelt, is just being an outdoorsman. And so, he recognizes the importance of setting aside this land and keeping it out of development. So you don't just cut in and clear cut all that land for timber or for farming or for whatever reasons. He's going to create the U.S. Forest Service. He's going to help set up the national park system. He's going to set up, not help set up the national park system. So if you go out and enjoy any of the national parks, the Teddy Roosevelt's your guy there. He created the U.S. Forest Service, which set up 51 bird reserves, 4 game preserves for larger animals, 150 national forests, 5 national parks, and he's going to pass the 1906 Antiquities Act. The Antiquities Act is going to help protect national monuments. And so, there's 18 different national monuments that are going to be protected by the Antiquities Act. So he's going to try and preserve not just our wilderness, but also our history. And protect archaeological sites. So, I live in Southern Illinois. There's protections for things like Monk's Mound, the Cahokia's mounds, and because it's a part of our history and it deserves to be, if not respected, preserved, right? Because some of our history can be brutal and ugly, that's for sure. But if you want to make sure we don't repeat that, we have to constantly be having conversations about it. And Teddy's going to help preserve those. Real true conservationist, and actually our first conservationist president. And so, the which I think would blow most people's minds, that the first conservationist president is a Republican president. But interestingly enough, it is. Now, keep in mind, Teddy Roosevelt is not an ideologue. He's not a guy that just touts party line. He's his own independent, free thinker, which I think is probably ultimately a good thing. Teddy Roosevelt's legacy. He's responsible for all types of progressive reforms. I mean, this guy, gets the ball rolling on progressive reforms. He is the first conservationist president and really kind of starts that conservation movement, establishes the national park system, and after his term, in 1908, he will give up the presidency and will handpick William Taft. And so William Taft is, kind of going to end up being a reluctant president. He's never really wanted to be president. He's always wanted to be a Supreme Court justice, but he is considered a protege of Teddy Roosevelt. Now, Teddy Roosevelt will ultimately be upset at William Howard Taft's presidency, because of his stance on big business. Taft essentially breaks up all trusts, which was never Teddy Roosevelt's position. And because of that, Teddy Roosevelt will decide to run for a third term. He will not get the Republican nomination to be president. I think it's just they didn't want to go against the sitting president, William Howard Taft. And so he will create his own third party, the Bull Moose Party, and essentially split the Republican vote. When he splits the Republican vote, so, a significant portion of Republicans vote for William Howard Taft. A significant portion of Republicans vote for Teddy Roosevelt. The Republicans are about half of the population. The rest is a united Democratic Party that will unite behind Woodrow Wilson. And so, because Teddy Roosevelt runs as a third party candidate, it essentially ensures the election to the Democratic Party, and we get Woodrow Wilson as the president to follow William Howard Taft. All right, that concludes our election for today. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it very much, and I will see you again shortly.